From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I'm Chris Murphy. I'm the head of the Near East section here. And on behalf of the section and the African Middle Eastern Division, I want to wish you the warmest of welcomes and also convey the apologies of our chief, Dr. Mary Jane Deeb, who is unable to be here with us today. The African Middle Eastern Division, in whose reading room we are set up, is responsible for all of Africa, all of the Arab countries, Iran, Afghanistan, former Soviet Central Asia, the Muslim peoples of Western China, Hebraica and Judaica worldwide, Muslims in Russia and the Balkans, and of course, my favorite place, Turkey. I was a Turkish area specialist here for 22 years. Here in the division, approximately slightly more than 600,000 volumes are held in the Hebraic and the Near East sections. These are all volumes in the local languages. The collections began in the 19th century and have been separated because, of course, the vast majority of the languages are in a non-Roman script, most often either Hebrew script or Arabic script. And some, like the modern Turks, have been sort of grandfathered because their grandfathers are now great-grandfathers used the Arabic script, and to split off the modern Turkish collection from the Ottoman collection would be a kind of cultural crime. So they're still here with us. Also, in this division are the specialists who interpret and give access to the materials to researchers. And our researchers run the gamut from offices of the United States Congress, the federal bureaucracy, and the international scholarly public, and the general public. Some of the nicest events that I've had were working with individuals who brought in photographs from the old country that either their grandparents or great-grandparents had, and to read in Ottoman Turkish and have them say, oh, that's the picture of my grandfather? Now these noontime lectures that we have, in fact, one year we had 56 of them, which means one a week and probably several in some weeks, are part of the task given us by the Congress to make our collections known to the general public. And we are always exceedingly happy to have scholars who have produced books to come and speak about their books, especially books that reflect the culture of the area for which we are responsible. And that's what we are having today. And I'm now going to ask Mr. Hirad Dinavari, the Senior Reference Specialist for the Iranian world, to come forward and introduce today's speaker. Hirad.
Greetings, everyone. It's very good to have you here. I'm Hirad Dinavari, and I want to take a moment to thank you all for attending this lecture. As the Iranian World Reference Librarian, every year I have worked to host a cultural event in honor of the age-old tradition of Nowruz, marking the arrival of spring. Nowruz is a tradition celebrated by the peoples of the larger Iranian world and most of the Turkic-speaking world as well. This year, we are honored to have Dr. Rudi Matthee speak to us about Persian history. We are also showcasing a display of material culture and clothing from Kurdish lands, Iran, and Central Asia. Dr. Rudi Matthee is the UniDel, a distinguished professor of history at the University of Delaware, where he teaches Middle Eastern history, with a research focus on early modern Iran and the Persian Gulf. His books include The Politics of Trade in Safavid Iran, Silk for Silver, 1600s to 1730, Cambridge University Press, 1999. The Pursuit of Pleasure, Drugs and Stimulants in Iranian History, 1500s till 1900s, Princeton University Press, 2005, and the newly released title, Persia in Crisis, The Decline of the Safavids and the Fall of Isfahan. He co-edited with Beth Barron, Iran and Beyond, Essays in Honor of Nikki Keddie in 2000, and co-edited with Nikki Keddie, Iran and the Surrounding World, 1500 to 2001, Interactions in Culture and Cultural Politics in 2002. He has also published numerous articles on aspects of Safavid and Qajar Iran. He served as the president of the Association for the Study of Persianate Societies from 2009 till 2011. He received the 2006 Albert Hourani Book Prize awarded by the Middle East Studies Association of North America, and won the Saidi Sirjani Award 2004-2005, awarded by the International Society for Iranian Studies. By the way, we are filming this event with subsequent webcast on the library's website. At the end of the lecture, there will be some time for questions and answers for Dr. Rudi Matthee. Please be aware that by participating in the questions, you are consenting to being filmed and subsequently being webcast on the library. I am also very pleased to announce that we have copies of Dr. Rudi Matthee's book, Persia in Crisis, available for at the end of the reading room for him to sign at the end of the event. Enjoy the lecture and also take a moment to look at our lovely display we have of material culture. Thank you, and Dr. Rudi Matthee.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Dr. Hirad Dinovari and Dr. Murphy for kindly inviting me today. It's a great honor for me to be here, and thank you all for coming. It's very nice to see Dr. Pourhadi here, and I would also like to single out my two sons who are attending this lecture. Makes me very proud. Now I'm going to talk about my book, my latest book, Persia in Crisis, the decline of the Safavid decline and the fall of Isfahan. But I'd like to branch out a little bit beyond the Safavid state. And I'll come to that in a minute. First of all, for those of you who are not totally familiar, just 2 or 3 lines about Safavid Iran, situated in the so-called early modern period, founded in 1501 as a Sufi formation coming out of a Sufi sect. Taking power in northwestern Iran and branching out from there and lasting until 1722 formally, which is the date when Safavid Isfahan, that is the capital at the time, falls to a cohort of Afghan tribesmen. Now, in the intervening 2 centuries, many important things happened. The 2 or 3 most important aspects of Safavid Iran that need to be singled out are the fact that they established the first officially Shia state in the world, and Iran is still the only officially Shia state in the world, so that left a real legacy. And the second of it is that they consolidated Iran's boundaries more or less in the way that they still exist, with some changes and some alterations over time. And thirdly, that they introduced a number of institutions with staying power that lasted really into the 20th century, and some remnants of which still exist today. Now, Iran then and now, of course, didn't exist in a vacuum. It was part of a surrounding world, and that surrounding world is what I really would like to focus on. And I'm really talking about the Ottoman Empire and to the left, so to speak, and the Mughal state to the right. Do I have a cursor here? I do, yes. So the Safavid Iran is located in the middle, so to speak. The Ottomans are located to the left, and the Mughals are located to the right. Now, these 3 have lots of things in common. They are a continuum, if you will, and it operates on a number of different levels. trade and politics, warfare, very important, exchange of art, and cultural patterns in general. And they're oftentimes seen as part of a continuum. They've been called the gunpowder states, a term that has somewhat gone out of fashion these days. They're all tributary empires, and I don't have time to go into that, what that means, but it's basically extracting tributes, not necessarily taxes, from far-flung regions. They also are, they have similarities in terms of being patrimonial bureaucratic empires. Now, we scholars oftentimes talk about these three as a threesome and in comparative terms, but actually very little work has been done, comparatively speaking. They're more often juxtaposed than compared on the ground, and that's what I would like to do. I didn't really do that in the book because it wasn't the topic, but it's really sort of an outgrowth of the book and a first foray into that kind of exercise with which I will be engaged in this lecture. The problem, in part, is that scholars of these respective empires tend to talk past one another. They don't engage in a discourse. It's beginning to change, but still we have vested interests, we have long traditions. Ottomans tend to look west towards Europe because that's where the modernity lies and that's where the wars, the most important ones presumably, are fought. And they don't know Persian. Iranians have their own sense of magnitude and grandeur. They don't think it's important to look either left or right oftentimes. And they're also hampered by limited language abilities. And the Mongols have a very strong connection to England, which comes out of colonial times. They oftentimes only know English, and their Mughal works translated into English. And they focus sort of from a perspective that is located in the colonial period that superseded and succeeded the Mughal state. So none of that is really conducive to a fruitful collaboration and a discourse and a discussion. And that's what I would like to do. The topic I'm tackling here is the one the book is about, and that is decline. Now, decline is a shared theme, one of the shared themes of these Persianate societies. You know, one of the things that really brought them together, perhaps the most profound commonality, is a shared sense of cultural patterns conveyed in Persian as the main language, the language of the elite, the language of arts and letters and so forth. But decline is definitely perhaps a less glamorous aspect, but it is definitely one. But it's also very problematic. Decline has become the D word when it comes to the Middle East. We can still talk about the decline of Venice after its heyday. We talk about the decline of the Dutch Republic after the glorious golden age of the 17th century. We talked about the decline of the British Empire legitimately, and now we're talking about the decline of America. It's barely reached its apex and is declining, right? But to talk about the decline of the Ottomans is no longer something that one can do unself-consciously. And there's a whole movement, has been a whole movement in the last 20 years against this notion that they declined at all. There are even books now that argue that, no, they didn't decline at all. They actually reached their apogee, or if there was a dip, it was a temporary one, and they reached fullness again in the 18th and 19th century. In the case of the Ottomans, the Mughals, it's a different discourse. Decline is incontrovertible and undeniable, because after all, the Mughals did dissolve. But then they were sort of brought into a new dispensation, a colonial dispensation, the British Empire, which can actually be blamed to some extent for the previous decline. So you have a way out. In the middle, in Iran, there is no such way out. There is no comfort zone. You can't point to something that dipped but then rose again in magnificent ways, because there is the black hole of the 18th century. Isfahan fell, and it fell hard and raw to these Afghans. And after that, there's a century of anarchy, of chaos, of warlords running around. And then we have the Qajar dynasty, and you know, we can debate the quality of the Qajars, but we can certainly call them a new glorious period of centralized statecraft from the very beginning, right? So we have a problem. There is decline. How are you going to explain it? You can't explain it away. You have to face it head on. That's what I do in the book. I take it head on. And again, it's the core element of the talk today. I'm going to spend the remainder of my time, 20 minutes or so, dividing my lecture into 4 parts, 4 constituent parts, 4 elements of life and society, where I talk about the Safavids, and they're the centerpiece of my talk, but I do, again, so in a comparative way, juxtaposing, comparing, you know, evaluating in relative ways. First, the economy, very important, oftentimes overlooked, beginning with the physical the topography of the land, very important. And in our idealized way of looking at Middle Eastern history, both scholars and the inhabitants oftentimes overlooked. And then I'll move on to political conditions, which partly emerge from these sort of basic structures, economic and topographical and physiological. And then I'll move on to military issues, and then the final part will be devoted to ideology. Again, each only gets 5 minutes because I don't have more time, but hopefully there'll be questions to flesh things out. Economic conditions, and now let me pay attention to the PowerPoint. Quite frankly, when we look at Iran, again in comparative perspective, we see a major difference. We see a country of very low population density. It's been estimated that Iran at the time, and really far into the 19th century, had anywhere between, what, 6, 7, 8, 9 million people. I mean, very low on the ground. Very, you know, there's no density. And they're also concentrated in urban centers for the most part. So in other words, vast areas of nothingness where no one lives, with major consequences, of course, for the organization of life, for safety, for, you know, distances having to be covered by trade, costs, and so forth. And of course, a lot of that land consisted of fearsome deserts and inhospitable terrain in general, very low productivity, steppes, and I'm not even talking about the eastern half, which is mostly waterless desert, the Dasht al-Lut and the Dasht al-Kavir, completely parts of it uninhabitable and of extremely low agricultural yield. Agriculture in Iran was mostly concentrated in Azerbaijan, partly in Khorasan, some in Fars, and then some in the rocky terrain of the east, but there too, I'm sorry, in the western part of the country, Kurdistan, Luristan, but still major obstacles. And then of course we have the fertile provinces of the Caspian Sea as a major exception to low rainfall and very low productivity. But it didn't make up, it didn't really compensate for this, the largest part of the country being rather inauspicious in terms of a surplus. And mind you, we have concentrated on trade when it comes to Safavid Iran, but that is something that the sources lead us to, because after all, it's mostly trade-related sources that have survived, but effectively, we don't have real percentages, but by the best estimate, 80% of revenue came from agriculture in Iran, and anywhere else for that matter. So trade should not blind us to the fact that Iran was, relatively speaking, a poor country. This is all pre-oil, of course, which was exacerbated by the fact that there were no gold and silver mines, at least no exploitable ones in Iran. In other words, Iran had to import all of its gold and silver. There's a long chapter in the book about that, how the Shahs dealt with that sort of endemic and structural scarcity of coin. And then the problem was, because Iran was so little productive, most of the money that came in actually left the country through the back door, through the Persian Gulf towards India, which was the sink until modern times, really, of gold and silver in the world. India and China were the powerhouses of manufacturing until the Industrial Revolution. That's where all the precious metal ended up. So Iran was basically what's the term? A clearance house of a lot of the precious metal, which didn't help either. It had some positive effects because it kept inflation low, but it didn't really generate productive growth, if you will. Now compare that to Ottoman Empire, you know, with its Balkans, fertile by any Middle Eastern standard, Egypt, a breadbasket traditionally, and you get the picture. Even more so when you look the other side, you know, towards India. You know, India was immensely fertile. The Punjab stretching for hundreds of miles. You planted a growth 3 times a year, abundant rainfall, rivers. Iran has no rivers. Problem with transportation too. Riverine transportation is impossible in Iran. And so, you know, if you look at it comparatively speaking, you begin to see some major differences. All of it was exacerbated, which is specific to the time, but not unimportant that people are really getting into this now for the first time, by a suspiciously frequent series of droughts and famines in the course of the 18th century. So-called Little Ice Age. There's a beautiful book that just came out in Ottoman studies about that. And for Iran, I don't think evidence is as substantial and substantive for lack of sources, but from what I've been able to gather, and I mentioned some of it in the book, there is a frequent occurrence of droughts and famines in the 1670s, 80s, and 90s, and to my mind, this plays a very important role actually in the tribal people coming from the east to the boundaries of Iran, what's today in Iran and Afghanistan, moving in search of fertile lands, in search of livelihood, driven out of their famine conditions. So the second part, well, these are the Shahs. I should have started with that. I'll, leave you to look at that for a minute or so, because I will mention some of them. Shah Ismail is, of course, the founder of the dynasty, the political founder, and then we have Shah Tahmasp, the second one, the longest reigning one, and I'll skip those. Shah Abbas is the most important of the Shahs of the Safavid state, and then we have Shah Safi and Shah Abbas II. The last two are the ones when decline really becomes prominently visible on many levels. Can you see all that? Okay. So this is a picture that shows you the court under the Shah Abbas II, indicating, and this is the point I'm going to make, that there's a huge paradox involved when we come to talk about political conditions, because politically speaking, and sort of spilling over into culture, Iran flourishes in the 17th century. Isfahan, founded by Shah Abbas at the turn of the 17th century, is an emblem of imperial grandeur. He redesigns this capital. He builds, fantastic buildings that still stand. And I'll show you, I hope I have, this is, of course, Isfahan as it appears to you today, the beautiful and renowned and celebrated Maidan Shah, the central square, which was developed by Shah Abbas, a combination of commerce and statecraft and religious power and expression with its beautiful mosques and the the audience hall, and I'm not sure, I don't think I have a picture of that, unfortunately. But anyway, the Ali Khapu on the other side of the square, and all that was there and representing the radiant culture of Safavid Iran, the culture for which Iran was known at the time, and why Iranians going to India in search of jobs, in search of employment, were well received, because they brought with them a sort of an aura of sophistication and readily found employment in high circles at the Mughal court. So we have cultural effervescence expressed in splendid architecture, brilliant philosophy, not to forget Mullah Sadra, the school of Isfahan. All of that takes place right in the middle of the 17th century, a time when arguably, or at least I argue, we see also at the same time the signs of economic and political decline. We all know that great art doesn't necessarily coincide with great freedom or political conditions that make life easy and comfortable. There is no regicide. So on that political level too, there is no fratricidal warfare. We don't have huge internecine warfare in Iran at the time. In other words, the Shahs die in the 17th in their bed, and their succession is not marked by huge struggles, but it's a peaceful transition typically. We only have a few grand viziers, another marker of stability. One, Sheikh Ali Khan, rules for a full 20 years, and he too dies in his bed. So there are all the signs of stability, which is actually one reason why the famous travelers go to Iran at the time. Chardin and Tavernier, the ones we still read, speak of this flourishing realm with safe roads and comfortable conditions, and actually compare it relatively well to conditions in Europe. Chardin famously says the Iranian peasant is, the average Iranian peasant is better off than the average French peasant. Okay. They also detected signs of decline. They talked about money and debasement and decreasing productivity. So they weren't blind to those, but still we have a mixed picture. And it's a paradox, especially again if we branch out to the Ottomans and the Mughals, because you look at the Ottoman Empire and it's a mess in the early 17th century. Sultans are killed, they're strangled, they're deposed. We have the Janissary revolts that wreak havoc in eastern Anatolia, that endanger roads. And And we have ultimately a number, I think a total of something like 17 grand viziers in the course of the 17th century, 11 of whom are deposed, a number of whom are killed, and I think only one lives out his term peacefully. A stark difference with Iran indeed. You look east, Mughal India is engaged in almost continuous fratricidal war in the mid-17th century. Shah Jahan comes to power in the same welter of discord and fratricidal war as when he goes out 30 years later, with brother fighting against brother, killing each other. He himself is kept locked up in prison by his successor, Aurangzeb. So lots of political turmoil, none of it in Iran. Okay, so there's an interesting paradox. Now, how do we resolve the paradox? I don't really have time to go into detail about it, but one of the things that I argue in the book, and that I will certainly further elaborate on in an article that hopefully will come out of this, is that the Shah, unlike the Sultan and the sultans on either side, you know, the Ottomans and the Mughals, retained their aura of being a reflection of the divine in a much stronger way. The Shah was on a different plane somehow. He remained unassailable. There's some cracks that appear in that facade. Towards the end, we begin to see some grumbling about Shahs not fulfilling their divinely appointed obligation to, you know, execute the Sharia and live up themselves in their own lifestyle to the precepts of Islam. You know, fornicating and drinking at will in the palace to everyone's knowledge and so forth. But by and large, we have very little of that. The Shah remains this unassailable, sort of, you know, divinely appointed reflection of God, if you will. In other words, they remain totally pivotal on the system. And while the system breaks down, and it does begin to break down, because the Safavid Shahs end up retreating into the palace, whereas Shah Abbas is still a warrior. He goes around on horseback, he patrols the realm, the boundaries, which you have to do as a Shah. The Shah is a mixture of severity and cruelty even, you know, setting examples, chopping off heads at appropriate times, and mudara, you know, tolerance. You also have to be magnanimous. You can't just be a Saddam Hussein. You also have to show magnanimity at times, mercy to people. It's that balance that keeps you in power, right? Shah Abbas fulfilled that imperative, if you will, but the later Shahs just retreated into the palace and engaged in lust and play, as it is called in the Persian chronicles. And they lost a lot of their aura by that, certainly their military aura. They were no longer feared. And what you see is clerics running grain rackets, hoarding and then selling at high prices, and provincial governors fleecing the population with impunity, because the Shah is no longer there to lay down the line and chop off heads, literally. In the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal state, I think it's less urgent, because the Shah, the sultans there do not have the same kind of divine quality. In other words, they're replaceable much more than the Safavid Shah. The Sultan declines in terms of his prestige and his capacity to act. He also retreats into the palace to some extent. But it's the Grand Vizier who takes over, who picks up the slack. He becomes the stand-in, the replacement of the Sultan. And the Ottoman Empire is arguably lifted out of its torpor to some extent by the Köprülüs, that dynasty of very forceful Grand Viziers in the later 17th century who take the lead, who engage in war, who, you know, take control, if you will. There's nothing in the Iranian sense, because the Shah remains the pivot. Everything remains dependent on the Shah, for better or for worse. So no one can act on his own. So the state dissolves in factions, in mutually warring factions, but no one can sort of drift up and percolate up, because the Shah remains at the apex and at the vortex of that whole power struggle. And the result is, of course, that the state becomes fairly dysfunctional. You look at the Mughal state, India, and you see the same kind of situation that obtains in the, well, it's different from these other three dispensations, because when you look at Aurangzeb, the ruler who comes to power in 1657, he was a bigot, and I will come back to that when I talk about ideology. but he was certainly no weakling. He led the troops still. He conquered the Deccan, brought in a lot of money. In other words, he engages in warfare, the kind of warfare that is necessary, because all these states are ultimately premised on warfare, on continuous warfare. And this is where I transition into the military aspect, which is crucial and fundamental, but of course cannot be understood without this political and economic context, because war costs money. War potentially brings in money, but before it produces revenue, it costs lots of layouts. You know, logistics and, you know, mobilizing armies and so forth. Conquest is very expensive. So now, quite simply, the Ottomans and the Mughals continued to fight. The Ottomans were forced to fight because, after all, they were fighting on the European front in the Balkans, where they ended up slowly retreating, but still it was a hard-fought battle that spread out over centuries. And they couldn't just make peace, because Istanbul would have been conquered with the newly, you know, forceful European armies that were moving very fast in terms of developing new technologies and new logistics and new weaponry and so forth. So the Ottomans, even if they weren't advancing, they didn't have the luxury of making peace really with the Europeans. And they kept fighting into the 18th century. The Mughals kept fighting as well, more actively. I just mentioned Aurangzeb conquered the Deccan, south central India. And it was actually a big money maker. It brought in an enormous amount of revenue because southern India was traditionally gold-based, so it brought in enormous amounts of treasure, gold treasure. And so this image of the warrior king persists, even in the Ottoman case. Sultan Murad IV at least projects the image. He doesn't really live up to it, but he moves to Edirne. He moves the court from Istanbul to Edirne, which is, you know, the traditional sort of frontier town in the wars against the Balkans. And again, he projects himself that way. Not so the Safavids. Long before Shah Suleiman, the one who's typically cast as the sort of the one under whose rule the whole thing begins to dissolve into debauchery and torpor, the Safavids, in an extraordinary moment, give up on war voluntarily. I think this is a unique moment, certainly at the time. I can't think of any equivalent at the time. Perhaps the Japanese giving up the gun in the 17th century, in the famous title of that book. What I'm referring to here is the Peace of Zuhab, which is signed in 1639. It came after the Ottomans had reconquered Iraq. Iraq was, of course, always the hinge, you know, the pivotal area, the back and forth frontier. It was, I think, for 90 years in the 220 years of Safavid rule in Safavid hands, shifted back and forth between them and the Ottomans. The Ottomans were typically the aggressors, if you look at the whole record. And I think it was in part induced by the realization on the part of the Safavids that they were numerically and logistically the weaker party. There are indications from the early sources that the Safavids realized that they could never really definitively win against the Ottomans in terms of, you know, numbers and logistics and power, sheer, you know, military might. And so in 1639, the Ottomans, having reconquered Baghdad, and reconquering Iraq mainly meant that, and not much else, Mosul and Baghdad, and hopefully Basra, but that was not always the case. Very difficult country to control, as we all know, even then. They called it quits. They made a peace, whereby they definitively ceded Mesopotamia, Iraq, to the Ottomans, which would remain in Ottoman hands until the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. And the Persian chronicles are explicit in the reasons why this peace was made, and in a rare moment of honesty, because they are not typically honest about these things. Shah suffers a defeat. The chronicles are not there to tell you the truth, but to, you know, celebrate and hail the exploits of the Shah. It's an embarrassing moment. You have to talk around it, right? You have to turn defeat into victory if you can. In this particular case, it is remarkable that they list a desire for peace and prosperity as a driving force behind this agreement. Now, the driving force behind that driving force clearly, and again I spelled it out in the book, is women and eunuchs who've taken control of the harem, and they are the pacifist camp. There's a big struggle going on between the Turkic Qizilbash warriors who want to continue war, because that's their thing, that's their livelihood and their prestige. That's what makes them manly on the one hand, and on the other hand, the women and the eunuchs who just want comfort and, you know, peace. And so they went out, and the Peace of Zuhab is the result of that. And, well, then we, of course, we get into the question of the sort of the peace dividend. That should have brought in money, that should have created revenue, right? Well, not necessarily, because Iraq, I don't think, was ever a money-making business. In part because no one ever really controlled it. You could extract direct revenue, but sort of sustained, you know, long-term investment was very difficult and really impossible. So I don't think that mattered all that much. But the fact is, of course, that, and this is the most important effect of this peace, is that it led to a neglect of the army, a systemic neglect. And we all know an army that doesn't fight becomes rusty and loses its fighting capacity. And that's exactly what happened to the Safavids. The whole thing was already instilled in part by deliberate cost cutting, which is always a problem. And I'm coming back here to the lack of silver and gold mines, perennial scarcity of money. There was no money to pay the troops. And this was an easy way of, you know, saving expenses. A lot of expenses ended up being sort of diverted to the palace, and because the Shahs kept building palaces, prestige objects rather than functional and you know, commonsensical projects. But the ones that suffered were the army. And what you see happen is very interesting. Again, this is where the physical environment is important and relevant. It is very clear that the Iranians from that moment on felt safe behind their deserts and their mountain ranges. They felt they had strategic depth. It's like the Russians. Invade, invade. You'll be your own undoing. You'll suffer. You'll freeze to death in the steppes of, you know, White Russia before you reach Moscow. In the Iranian case, it's very clear that they counted on troops being sucked into the interior and starving from thirst, from exposure and thirst. Iranian soldiers themselves, according to reports, were stragglers in these vast expanses towards India and especially towards the east for the same reasons. You know, very harsh environment. But by the same token, they felt relatively safe in their urban environments inside the plateau, if you will, surrounded by these fearsome mountains and awe-inspiring deserts. So they were sort of lulled into a false sense of security, if you will. So there was definitely no imperial overstretch with the Safavids, which is another issue that I don't have time to go into. But rather than overstretching, the Safavids retrench and feel safe. And then, of course, they aren't safe because, and now I'm going to the last part, it's the 5 minutes ideological conditions. And here, and I'll be very brief because I don't want to run out of time. I want to give you 15 minutes for question and answer. We see a number of interesting developments where we also detect a comparative element. And that is the growing prominence of religion, that is officially articulated religion. Of course, religion was always there. People were religious, pious, not necessarily the court. The court, Shah Abbas is a very good example, had a secular will to power. The court, and there are reports about this, if it weren't for the Shah, the mullahs would run this place, and you know, people would suffer no end. All the minorities would be oppressed. The Jews and the Armenians would be run out of town. It's the Shah that provides this sort of buffer. You know, it's like the Jews in Russia. As long as the Tsarist regime was strong, they felt protected. You know, it's with the decline of strong central government that the mob begins to rule. It's the same in Iran. The mob led by the mullahs, quite frankly. So religion as state ideology, not just projected, but stridently articulated, comes to the fore. In all these three states, again, we have interesting similarities. And the real underlying reasons have yet to be studied, I think. I think it's in part precisely because of the decrease in strength and the growing weakness of the secular power of the Shahs and the Sultans and their direct entourage, that the clerical forces see a chance to come up and claim their stake, if you will. But what you do see is movements in all these three states of clergy-led claim to, you know, being part of state power and having a say in state power. It comes out in the Qadi Zadali movement, in the Ottoman Empire, in various installments, resulting in growing, shall we say, discrimination and even oppression of non-Muslims. It comes very clearly out in the policies of Aurangzeb, famously, of course, who reinstates the jizya, the poll tax for non-Muslims, who's known to have burned lots of Hindu temples, who've turned on the screws in minorities in general. And it comes out in the Safavid state too, towards the end, especially under Shah Sultan Hussein, the one who presides over the demise of the state. And it is, of course, the famous or infamous Mohammad Baqer Majlisi, the Sheikh al-Islam, the head of the clerical establishment, who's notorious in this regard. This Shah is a weakling, and he rules under the spell of his great aunt. Women, too, become very important at the court at the time, but more so under the spell of Baqer Majlisi, who introduces a series of politics or policies that are definitely meant to put the non-Shia population in its place. So Armenians, clearly, taxes go up consistently. Jews, there are outbreaks of discriminatory, campaigns, in part directed against expressions of so-called vice, coffee houses, which are seen as disruptive and subversive in terms of politics, certainly wine houses and the consumption of drugs in general. All these become the targets of these periodic outbursts. They never last long because they're always bought off. A bribe always helps. And it's oftentimes also the kind of zeal that comes up with the coming to power of a new Grand Vizier or a new Shah, and who has to sort of project his power and his religious credentials, and then it wears off. The law is never really executed and enforced as severely the second year as when it's proclaimed, if ever. So, these things tend to be periodic and episodic rather than sustained, but still, we see enough of these moments to perceive patterns. Very interesting towards the end is the periodic reiteration of the so-called law of impurity in Iran, whereby non-Shia Muslims are forbidden from leaving their homes, especially during times of rain, lest they contaminate through rain Muslims, that is Shia Muslims. Those laws have always been on the books, but they're particularly visible and become reinforced and are periodically proclaimed towards the end of the 17th, early 18th century. Now, none of that really matters in the grand picture in terms of decline, except that in the case of the Armenians, it does matter, because the Armenians are a thriving community since the early 16th century. This is a picture, sort of a global, or at least a hemispheric picture of the reach and the trade activities of the Armenians located near Isfahan in New Julfa, where Shah Abbas had given them a suburb and given them some protection and some rights. This is the span of their activities. You can see all the way from England, Amsterdam, London is not indicated. I don't know why not, because there was an Iranian Armenian community there, all the way to the Philippines, East Asia, what is today Indonesia, through India, Russia, and so forth. Their status and their money-making capacities were legendary in the early 17th century. Their situation deteriorates. The conditions deteriorate in the later 17th century. Taxes are increased. Discrimination increases in various ways. Their life becomes much more difficult. The law whereby an Armenian, if he converts to Islam, can claim the assets, the property of all of his family members, comes to the fore and induces lots of Armenians to convert. In other words, security of property decreases. It's a very important issue. And the result is the Armenian community begins to leave. They decamp to Russia, they go to Venice, they go to Rome, where they acquire city rights, and they take their money with them. So that's a clear effect of politics having a negative effect on economics and ultimately the viability of a state. So that's one example. More importantly, in the end, is the policy versus the Sunnis, the most numerous minority inhabiting the fringe. And I have a very nice picture towards the end. This is, by the way, no time to go into that. It's in the book, a whole chapter in the book. The decrease in the number of the mints in the 17th century. This is the situation in the 16th century, situation in the mid-17th century, situation towards the end. All the mints dry up. It's an enormous scarcity and a growing scarcity of money, of ready money. And then here, the last picture shows you graphically, I think, the situation towards the end, where we have all these tribal peoples surrounding Iran, and they're not foreigners, which is something I need to mention, because the typical Iranian interpretation is we were overrun by foreign Afghans, primitive tribesmen. Well, yeah, they were peripheral, but they weren't foreign, because call them foreign is a modern and uncalled for nationalist interpretation. So that aside, Iran was surrounded by these tribal formations, and you see them on this map. And most of them, if not all of them, happen to be Sunni. Okay? Now, as long as the Safavids had arrangements in place, the kind of arrangements that made pre-modern and early modern state function, which is not simply by brutal violence and oppression, you have to win hearts and minds. How do you win hearts and minds? Just force never works in the long term. You buy people. You make them part of the system. You give them a stake in the system. It's like the Sunni revival, you know, the Americans in Iraq, or what they're doing with the Taliban now. It's exactly the same thing. It's a time-honored device. You give them a stake in the system. You pay them a tribute, an annuity, to keep the really bad guys out. You know, the real mountaineers from Dagestan, for example. So you pay the Lezgis in Georgia, you know, keep them quiet that way. You pay the Afghans, and you put them in charge of the caravan trade between Iran and India, so they get a nice cut, okay? And as long as you do that judiciously, and there's a central apparatus that oversees that, the continuity and all that, things work. That's how you run an empire. You don't have the manpower to run an empire with having, you know, bases all over the place. You don't have the logistics, you don't have the money. So you make arrangements, you negotiate. It's all about negotiation, okay, on a basis of realism. Now, what do the late Safavids do? They pull back, they neglect, they cut the subsidies, in part to cut, you know, expenditure, but also because of this newly instituted sort of vociferous focus and concentration on Shia Islam as the carrier of the state. And we have plenty of reports of Georgian soldiers, because most of the soldiers in late Safavid Iran were Georgians, recruited from the Caucasus, behaving terribly in what is today Western Afghanistan, in Herat and especially in Kandahar. You know, not just discriminating, but mocking and, you know, just using mosques, Sunni mosques as stables and abusing boys, you know, bachabazi, and then killing them and dumping the bodies at their parents' homes and so forth. That's the best way to create lots of antagonism very fast. And that's exactly what happened. They yanked Mirwaisis. Mirwais was a warlord, a pivotal warlord. They yanked his position as the overseer of the caravan trade. They took it away from him. What do you expect? The guy was hopping mad, starts a revolt. It's the beginning of the end. And then, of course, we have the droughts and the famines that are sufficiently well recorded to make us think that they do play a role, even though it may not have been the most important one, but the combination was definitely lethal. It brought the tribal fringe into the center. It sucked them in. It made them into enemies. And the people in between, the Armenians living in Kerman and Yaz on the front line, actually ended up collaborating with these invaders because they had their own gripes with the late Safavids. And that's how this state dissolved. It had been hollowed in from the inside, but the external part had not been taken care of well. And so the whole thing just went up in smoke, or whatever the metaphor might be. But certainly Isfahan fell relatively quickly. I mean, it was a 6-month siege. But before that, the Afghan invaders encountered very little resistance. And they found the state in total disarray, factionalized, where faction was working against faction, collaborating with the Afghans, no unity of purpose. And so ready for the picking. Thank you.
Let's try this now. Okay, my bad. Okay, we have about 5 minutes for questions. All right, can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. All right, so we have about 10 minutes for questions, and how about this? I'm going to ask anyone who has a question to come up here around and ask the question here, because when I move, it starts to make noise. So if you have any questions, raise your hand. All right, feel free to come here. Okay, go ahead and say your question. I will say it out loud. Yeah.
No, I'm not, sorry. I don't quite understand what you're trying to...
The Sunnis dominate Islam.
Right.
Shia or West, how is Iran convinced to become a Shia?
Oh, right, okay, that's a good question. Well, very briefly, Iran was overwhelmingly a Sunni country in 1500. And when we use these terms, we have to be cautious because, what did it mean to be a Sunni or a Shi'i? Most people didn't really have no clue. But still, the Safavids came in, Shi'ism was their sort of battle cry, if you will, and they spread Shi'ism mostly through violence. They forcibly converted people to Shi'ism. And of course, people didn't necessarily convert by heart or through the heart immediately, but over time, over the next 2 centuries, the majority of Iranians did gravitate towards Shi'ism to the point where Iran ended up a majority Shi'i country over time. But it's an exception, of course, because it's the only country in the world today, even today, where Shi'ism is a state religion. It's also the country with the largest percentage of Shi'is, about 90%. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's a brief version of the story.
Any other questions? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Peter. Yeah.
What I find stunning about your account, especially as compared to the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire, and maybe it's a little bit anachronistic the way I ask the question, is the absence of imperialism. Because when you talk about the decline
Right.
of the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire,
Right.
particularly the Ottoman Empire, starting from the 17th century, you would have to add to the military threat, of course, the imperialist penetration of the country. The way how, for instance, minorities gain in importance in many ways, the
Right.
protection to the imperialist powers.
Right, right.
The East India Company and
Right.
the Mughal case
Right,
also
right.
making inroads, the ocean becoming the
Right.
ground for
Yeah.
European penetration. So why is this?
Because it doesn't play a role in Iran.
Could we quickly recite the question
Yeah.
for the recording
Yeah,
purposes?
it's an excellent question. Why did I not pay any attention to the imperial or imperialist dimension where in the Ottoman Empire you see that the minorities gain economic power in the course of time, in part because they're being assimilated or being protected by these, the British or the English and the Dutch, these foreign nations. And in the Mughal state too, foreign elements make inroads into the interior and so forth. And that's all true, even though I don't think it should be exaggerated, certainly not in the case of the Mughals, more so in the case of the Ottomans, where after all, the proportion of minorities, meaning Christian minorities, was of course far, far greater. About half of the Ottoman population was non-Muslim in a way. The Mughal state, of course we have Hindus, but they don't really, they're in a different category here. Well, the answer is that in Iran presents a completely different picture because the number of minorities, that is certainly Christians, is minute in terms of numbers. And yes, the Armenians play a disproportionately large role in commerce, but they certainly don't come under the quote-unquote protection of the foreigners. And that's in part has to do again with logistics and the physiological circumstances. The foreigners had what? How many foreigners were there anyway? About 100 in Iran at any time. these merchants. Most of them were sitting in Bandar Abbas, 1,000 miles from Isfahan, and they had a factory with 3 or 4 people in Isfahan. And they had absolutely no role in protecting Armenians. In fact, the Armenians themselves were the most, fierce enemies of these foreigners, because to the extent that foreigners were clerics, and there were some, and again we're talking about minute numbers, some clerics, Jesuits and so forth, they tried to convert these people, and they hated it, because it led to factionalism within the Armenian community, the Gregorians against the Catholics and so forth. So they actually tried to undermine the position of the foreigners, and they succeeded quite a bit because they had some pull at the court. The Queen Mother was the patrons of the Armenian community, so they had some good, what is it called? They had a lobby in Isfahan. So the foreigners had no leg to stand on. They didn't get anywhere. They were totally there at the beck and call and at the pleasure of the Shah. So it's a completely different situation. But it's an important question that I should really bring into the paper, if nothing else, to sort of preempt this kind of criticism, which is valid, but it doesn't really work in the case of Iran, because it's a different situation.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
Personally. There's been a lot of, those of us who study history, emphasis on how the Safavid Empire converted the entire population into a Shiite population.
Mm-hmm.
Before that, Iran too was majority Sunni. If they were so stretched out and they didn't have the means to have an empire and to do all the policing, and how were they able to in mass convert the Muslim population from Sunni to Shiite? I'm curious how that played out.
Yeah, it's a good question. And there are many holes in our knowledge, so I can't really give you a good answer. We depend on the chronicles for that type of information. And so what you typically see is that the conquest, certainly in the beginning, Shah Ismail is the major force here. He conquers Qazirun, for example, and he exterminates 3,000 people of some Sufi sect, and instills enough fear into the population that they come running to, submit themselves to Shia Islam. He goes to Baghdad, and again, 9,000 of its inhabitants are massacred, and it does the job. Now, how deep that goes is up to for debate, of course, but those were typically the methods that were applied by certainly the Shah Ismail. Later on, I think it's also a matter of osmosis. There's a tipping point, of course. You have 10% and then 30%, and the 30% have the big jobs, and then, people keep accumulating to the fold, I imagine.
How do you reconcile such great art, architecture, and people like Mullah Sadra with this type of religious bigotry towards non-Shiites, essentially?
Well, first of all, I come back to the original point that great art and great culture in general doesn't necessarily coincide with peaceful and stable political conditions. In fact, an argument could be made, and has been made, that it's quite the reverse, that political turmoil and insecure times produce, look at Sufism, the heyday of Sufism during and in the aftermath of the horrors of the Mongol invasion. But more importantly, or as importantly, mid-17th century Iran was a cauldron of political and religious discourse and debate. There were all kinds of groups and subgroups, even within Sufism. There were the hardliners, there were the more sort of, humanistic and capacious grouplings, and that was reflected in the court too, who they favored and who they tried to marginalize. In other words, there was a great deal of intellectual ferment. So again, I'm not a religious scholar. I'm certainly not focused on the school of Isfahan, so I can't give you any details, but that's the sort of the general context and framework.
Question.
Yes.
Do you see any similarities between the Shah and the current Islamic Republic in the way that you have the Ayatollah Khomeini and everything else? Do you see any similarities?
Yeah, I'm always reluctant to make direct.
The questions were: are there any comparisons between the current government with the Supreme Leader and the Shah in the Safavid period, as far as the person on top versus the rest. Go ahead.
Thanks. Well, I'm always reluctant as a historian to make these direct comparisons over 300 years. For a number of reasons, I think it's perilous to do so. But there is an element in the Iranian political culture, if you will, that really goes back to the beginning in a way of sort of elevating one person above everyone else and imbuing him with the divine grace and you know, giving him a stature that is unassailable by anyone. So in that sense, perhaps. Definitely in terms of religious policy and the alienation it creates towards non-believers, there are some similarities too. It's not for nothing that the Islamic Republic has adopted Mohammad Baqer al-Majlisi as one of its, you know, heroes, with postage stamps and commemorations and lots of biographies and so forth, because he might stand in as sort of a metaphor for that type of religious orthopraxis, orthodoxy, or anything like that. So yeah, there's some similarities, but I wouldn't push them too far.
I saw a list of Safavid kings.
Mm-hmm.
Two of them are more distinguished in Iranian history.
Right.
Shah Ismail
Sure.
and Shah.
Right.
So what does make them distinguished?
Well, in the eyes of Iranians or in my eyes? Because it's not necessarily the same thing. Okay. Right. Because, you know, the term great is, of course, open to interpretation. Napoleon was great too, but you know how many people he killed. Well, and again, directly from that, Shah Ismail was great in the sense that he forged a nation with a band of an incoherent band of warriors. But it came at great brutality. But the reason why he's called great is precisely because he gave Iran pride, like Nadir Shah, you know, one of the major mass murderers of all time, a warlord, a quintessential warlord, but he forged a nation and he gave a sense of pride. People are always inspired by military prowess somehow. It resonates. I would think that's a reason why Shah Ismail enjoys that stature. Shah Abbas, in part for similar reasons. You know, he centralized the state, he introduced some new elements, he built Isfahan, new structures, he galvanized trade, he was a great organizer, but he was also brutal. If you look at the you know, his behavior underneath, it's very clear he was the kind of warlord that he had to be in order to succeed. This is an unforgiving environment, you know, survival of the fittest, which is in part again goes back to this physiological environment.
One last question.
To what extent do you think this Shiism push under Shah Abbas was really politicized? When you look at the Fatimid in Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
1,000 years ago, several centuries before Safavid dynasty in general, and at the same time we had in Iran, different parts of Iran,
Mm-hmm.
where Shia leaders were basically, you know, at the upper hand from the Caspian coast
Mm-hmm.
all the way down to Fars and
Sure.
parts of Iraq.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
Question
to what
again.
extent do you think it was politicized?
Mm-hmm.
And I think what gentleman asked you was why, you know, there was no problem. I think it was a deliberate
Mm-hmm.
attempt by Shah Abbas to keep the borders,
Mm-hmm.
you know, kind of a buffer.
Mm-hmm.
The borders with the Kurds, with the Turkmens, with the Baluchis, and so on. They were all Sunni. They're still Sunnis today.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I think
Sure.
it was kind of limited to central Iran, the major population centers, as you mentioned. So it was a lot easier to control. But I was wondering, you know,
Yeah.
to what extent do you think it was really politicized,
Uh-huh.
knowing that there was history of Shiism
Mm-hmm.
way before it?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Did everyone hear that?
No,
Or?
I just want to repeat the question so they can record
Oh,
because
okay.
they're not
Right.
being recorded.
Yes. To what extent was the spread of Shia Islam a matter of?
Enforcement of the Shia Islam during the Shah Abbas.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, I'm not sure if I understood the question, but to the extent that I did, I would say that the spread of Shia Islam by the Safavids was clearly a deliberate and very successful mix between conquest and ideology. You know, if you conquer, you might as well have a message in order to persuade people, other than we're just, you know, conquering you because we want your taxes or we want to subjugate you. We also want to liberate you, if you want to bring you to the light. Shia Islam in this case. So I think that was a heady mix, and it worked to some extent. Now, the boundaries and how far they were, where they were established and why, I think remains an open question. And, you know, I don't think they wouldn't have gone further if they had not been able to. But they, first of all, met fierce resistance. They ran up, most notably, against mountaineers. You know, the Kurds, the Lezgis, the Afghans, the Turkmen, they were all hardy fighters for a number of reasons. You know, and the Arabs of Mesopotamia had always been known to be indomitable. No one ever controlled these guys until modern times. Beyond that, I come back to logistics. You know, when you look at the radius of how far an army could go from the center until modern logistics kicked in, it was, first of all, seasonally determined. You can't fight in the winter. Have you ever been to Erzurum and, you know, eastern Anatolia in the winter? You can't fight. The snow is like this, right? And second of all, you work with peasants, so, you know, they have to take care of the harvest and so forth. So you can only use them for a limited time of the year. And then there's simply logistics. You have to provision an army. So you look at the Ottomans, and the radius was basically 1,000 miles. They couldn't go beyond eastern Anatolia, western Tabriz. They conquered it a couple of times, but they went no further because they couldn't. It was logistically not possible. Same holds for the Iranians, the other way around. They could never go beyond Kandahar for that reason. They could never go beyond sort of central Anatolia, Iraq. That was about it. So I think that is maybe more important than the ideological reasons behind it. But again, all that has to be sorted out, and not enough work has been done on that, I think.
Okay, we have a book signing to do. There's books over there. Dr. Matthee's new book, Persian Crisis, is available if you would like to purchase. And take a look at our lovely exhibit that we have on material culture from Kyrgyzstan, Iran, Central Asia. Enjoy. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.